Okay, so thanks for joining these sessions of the virtual seminars in economic theory. Today we have Sarah Ridout from Vanderbilt, who is going to present Choosing for the Right Reasons. And we also have with us our guest panelists, Alvaro, Sandroni, and Yucheng, Liang. The format is a 60-minute presentation with time for interim questions from the panelists. This is followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. And after that, we are going to stop the recording, and everyone is please welcome to stay if you want for a chat afterwards. You can ask questions in the Q&A sessions, but if there's anything pertinent and important, you can also unmute yourself and ask Sarah directly during the talk. The talk is recorded. And before I hand out to Sarah, please let me remind you that next week we have Steve Callender from Stanford talking about market competition and political influence. Thanks, that's all from me. Sarah, the screen is yours.
Okay. This project is about preferences and choices coming apart. Now, there are lots of reasons that might happen. I'm interested in situations where some preferences are considered unacceptable to act on. Now, just to motivate this, you may be able to think of an instance in your own life where you volunteered for a committee, but really hoped that somebody else would serve on it. So what you did and what you wanted were not the same thing. Now, when you're in a situation like that, and you're concerned that your preference is not acceptable, one thing you might do is look around for a better reason to do the thing that you want to do. And throughout the talk, I'll call that better reason a justification. So for instance, if you didn't want to volunteer for the committee, but you felt like you ought to be generous with your time, you might be able to use your workload as an excuse for not volunteering, even if your workload wouldn't be so much of a consideration if you were considering some more enjoyable activity. Now, there's been lots of experimental work on this, roughly divided into two groups. First group shows that people do care about finding a justification for what they do, but when they have a choice between justifications, they make that choice in a self-serving way. So for instance, if many moral principles might apply in the situation you're in, you'll tend to choose the one that is most advantageous for you. And then the second group of papers provides evidence that when people get the opportunity, they manipulate their choice environment so they're justified in doing what they want. This is often done by selectively avoiding information. It can also be done by delegating certain decisions or avoiding certain choice problems entirely. Now, if you're thinking we've already got a model of this, there are probably two models you're thinking of. One of them is the model of Cherepanov, Feddersen, and Sandroni, and I'm very excited because we have one of these authors with us today. In their model, the decision maker is endowed with a preference and a set of rationales, and the rationales are simply binary relations. And the model of choice is that the decision maker maximizes his preference over the subset of alternatives that maximize at least one of the rationales or binary relations. Now, you might instead have been thinking of the limited attention model by Masatlioglu, Nakajima, and Osbe. Their model, decision maker again has a preference and again fails to consider some alternatives in his choice set. Now, that might be for reasons of justification, but it might also be because he's simply unaware of some alternatives in his choice set. Now, the bigger puzzle, rather than the difference between these two models, is that neither of them, to the best of my knowledge, and I've been presenting this work for quite a while, neither of these models has been used in experimental or applied work on justification. And that's kind of surprising because these models are well known, they've been around for a long time, and this is an active experimental area. So I'm going to tell you what I see as the main limitation of these models, well, the main three limitations of these models from an experimental point of view. And then I'll present a model that resolves those limitations. And the ultimate goal is going to be bringing the theoretical work back into alignment with the experimental and applied work in this area. So let's see what the limitations are. The first
Sarah,
one, yes, please.
Before you go on, there's a question in the chat which says, how about self-delusion models? And that's also a question I want to ask. Are you going to discuss models such as Vanderbilt, which are not exactly axiomatic models, but try to deal with the same issue?
Yeah, so brief discussion of that. Those models are related. They take a different approach where they explicitly model the beliefs of the audience, what inferences the audience are making. The reason that and I think the other authors didn't take that approach is because it's a lot of machinery to impose, which makes it difficult to apply the model to many different types of situations, which is the goal of this paper, that it should apply to situations with moral norms, other sorts of duties, laws, situations where people want to look virtuous. And because there's so little machinery in the actual setup, you're able to do that. Now, I think the advantage that those other models have that this model doesn't have is that they can tell you where the justifications come from. So they can tell you, for instance, which moral principles people might think that it's reasonable to appeal to. And I'm going to be silent on that point. So I think there are advantages to both of the approaches.
Thank you.
Okay. So limitations with the existing models that are related to this one. First one is that existing models don't provide us a good way of selecting between different representations. Now, that wouldn't be so much of an issue if different representations kind of told us the same thing, but it turns out that that's not the case. And in fact, different representations can easily have completely opposite implications. You don't have to look far for an example. In fact, I'm going to take the leading empirical example from CFS. In this example, the decision maker is choosing between two different rooms in which to watch a movie. Some of the rooms are occupied by a disabled person, some of them are empty. So let A be watching movie A in an empty room, B be watching movie B in an empty room, and then D be watching movie A with a disabled stranger. And then let's suppose that we observe the following choices: choosing A over B, B over D, D over A, and then B from the full set. Now, you'll notice if you inspect this choice pattern that this decision maker is choosing to sit alone if different movies are playing in the two different rooms, but otherwise he's choosing to sit with a disabled stranger. And so it looks like this is a person who doesn't want to sit with the disabled stranger, but he's only indulging that preference if he has the excuse of wanting to see a different movie. The problem is that both of these existing models I mentioned are actually consistent with D being preferred to A. And that's the opposite of prejudice because here the decision maker prefers to sit with a disabled stranger, other things equal. Now, you might think that I've picked out a really strange example, but it turns out, and we'll see later on, that this example is in fact entirely typical rather than unusual. And I'll clarify the sense in which I mean that later on. The second problem is that we currently don't know how to deal with between subject data. You might think, well, that's not a big issue, we'll just run within subject experiments. The problem is that in many of the situations where we would want to apply this model, people want to conceal their preferences. And so if we ask them a bunch of questions to try to elicit their preferences and we try to catch them in inconsistencies, if they figure out what's going on, they'll try to avoid those inconsistencies that we need to be able to separate out their preferences from their choices. Now, you might think we could just look at modal behavior. So we could just apply our existing single person models to modal behavior from between subject data. Now, in fact, this example on the last slide is actually based on doing that. But unfortunately, if you look at the original experiment, the full data is consistent with random utility. And so that original experiment is not actually evidence of justification, even though this particular, if this were just one person who were making these choices, it would be. Now, we do know the random utility axioms. So of course, if we want evidence that people are doing something other than utility maximization, we need to violate those. But that's not very helpful because we don't know which violations are consistent with justification, where we might expect to see those violations, or if we do observe some, what they might actually tell us about the structure of the justifications or preferences that people have. Final problem is that existing models don't have anything to say about information choice. And you might think that's very arbitrary. Why should they? The reason is that information choice provides some of the strongest evidence we have of this conflict between preferences and justifications. And the reason experimenters have focused on that is because if you observe some information avoidance, then you have a smoking gun that something other than preference maximization is going on. And in fact, there's a large literature known as the moral wiggle room literature that shows that people often do avoid information about the effects of their actions on others. I should note that I'm not discussing all information avoidance here. I'm discussing this specific literature that finds information avoidance in ethical settings. Now, there are some theories of that information avoidance, but they're very focused on information choice. And so they don't account for other behaviors that we observe when preferences and justifications conflict. And that means that the moral wiggle room literature ends up being very isolated from the rest of the literature on justification, even though they discuss the same mechanisms and it seems like they ought to be related.
Sarah?
Right. Yes, please.
Why can't those models be extended to talk about information avoidance? Is it because their justifications are not preferences like what you have in your model?
That's the idea. So it's possible that maybe you could come up with some way to extend them. Nobody has done that. I think it would be very intractable to do it because when you have preferences, especially if you impose expected utility, you have this really nice environment for talking about the resolution of information. It's not so clear how you would do it in those other models.
Got it.
So, Sarah, perhaps before moving on, you could spend some time on problem 1. I'm not sure if, because I didn't really understand problem 1 that well. Maybe if you go to that slide, I'll tell you a little bit.
Sure.
So you say different representations have completely opposite implications. Now, one of the things in this literature that is interesting is that the different models, including the ones that you mentioned, but there are others, right? Mazzini Mariotti and so on. They all have either identical or similar axiomatic structure. Which means that if we wanted to test them, right, we could use it, we could look for weak warp or something like this. And if you reject one, you reject all, or it's an exaggeration, it's not really true, but something close to this, right? So that means that there is a way to test them directly from choice itself, which is, theoretically how we would like it to be done. Anyway, so given that in the background, I didn't fully understand problem 1, and also I didn't really understand what you meant by different representations have completely opposite implications.
Okay, sure. I'm not trying to claim that those existing models have no empirical content. They certainly do have empirical content, and they will get you some identification. So for instance, in this example, if you were to apply your model, then you would have that A is preferred to B by all representations. But I would argue that the reason that we want to look at this example is because we care whether this person is prejudiced or not. And when we apply existing models to this example, we're not able to determine that because it could be that the person is prejudiced and he's just trying to conceal it, or there's another interpretation in which he's actually not prejudiced at all. In fact, he prefers to sit with the disabled person when other things are equal. And so that seems like a big problem because if we want to apply this model to learn about, say, people's implicit biases, then existing machinery is not really going to allow us to do that.
So this is what you're saying here when you say that it's consistent with D preferred to A, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And also A preferred to D.
Uh-huh. I haven't seen this, I'm sorry to say I'm a little rusty on this. It has been a while, but
no, this is the case. You actually point this out. So I'm not making a new observation about this example.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
Anyway, it's just so basically, if I understand what you're saying, is that yes, it has testable implications. We can test it, but is it the problem is some sort of identification, right? You don't know what's really driving the
right.
choices.
Because I think one of the main reasons that we'd want to apply these types of models is that we want to learn what people's preferences actually are, what obligations they actually perceive. And so even though there is some testable content, it doesn't seem to be strong enough to allow us to do that. So yes, the issue is really identification. It is not whether there are testable implications or not.
So if I'm correct in my expectations, later on during the talk, what you're going to do is to provide a model or an experiment or both that will be able to tell us conclusively what types of behavior are consistent with...
Yes, I am going to provide you an axiomatic representation theorem, and then I am going to tell you exactly what the identification properties of my model are.
Very good.
All right, so let's see what the model is. I'm actually going to keep the idea from existing work that people maximize their preferences over the subset of alternatives they can justify. I find that idea very simple and plausible. In fact, I'd start straight from existing models to resolve the limitations that I told you about if I could. But the problem is that they just don't have strong identification properties, and they're not really tractable enough to extend easily. And so I'm going to move to a special case in which the decision maker maximizes his preference over the subset of alternatives that maximize at least one preference in a set of preferences. So the decision maker's underlying preference is going to be denoted like this, as usual. And then the set of other preferences that the person is endowed with will be denoted script M. And I'll call the members of script M justifications. Here's how you should think of them: as capturing the decision maker's overall view of what a good person might value, or how a good person might live their life. You should not think of these as individual rules or principles, which of course are very likely to be incomplete. We'll see that this model has good identification properties and can be productively extended to between subject data and information choice. So formally, here's the model. I'm going to rule out ties for this talk. Paper allows them, doesn't really change anything. Domain of choice can be completely arbitrary. I'll be working with a choice function. A justification representation consists of a preference and a set of preferences, such that on any choice set, the decision maker maximizes his preference over the subset of alternatives that maximize at least one of the preferences in script M. Now, I want to make it very clear, this is a special case of existing work, and in fact, it's a fairly obvious one. So to get the CFS model, all you'd have to do is replace preferences with binary relations in script M. To get the MNO model, you would keep this basic structure, except rather than using justifications to determine the set that preferences are maximized over, you would use something more general. So the model is not really the contribution of the paper, the results are the contribution. So model clear. Okay. Now let's see.
Sarah,
yes, please.
Why did you say that we shouldn't interpret this as rules or principles? I would have thought that it's true that a rule is probably not a full preference, but you can simply say M includes all the preferences that satisfies that rule, right? Shouldn't that be fine?
That is fine. Sometimes people just misunderstand what the nature of a justification is, and they think that the members of script M are just rules, like don't kill or don't steal. The members of script M are preferences, and a preference would might incorporate many moral rules, or it might have trade-offs between different moral rules. So that's all I'm trying to say.
Got it.
Okay, so let's see what the identification properties of this model are. Now, you might hope, based on the earlier discussion, that I was going to get full identification of the decision maker's preference. But that's going to be too much to ask, and to see that, think about somebody whose behavior is consistent with preference maximization. Now, it's possible that he's just maximizing his preference, but it's also possible that he's minimizing his preference, and he's just limited to one really bad justification that is the opposite of his preference. Now, those two models are not equally appealing. The second model seems quite silly, and that's because in the absence of a compelling reason that people are doing something other than preference maximizing, we probably want to stick with the classical model that people maximize their preferences. Now I'm going to argue that you can make this work more generally, not just in this silly example. What we'd like is a focal preference that makes whatever the decision maker chose as high up in the preference ranking on his choice set as possible, given all of the choices that he made. So to formalize that, here's what we want. I'll denote the focal preference like this, and here's the definition of it. If we've got some preference in some justification representation that ranks C of A higher than some other alternative in A, then we want the focal preference to do exactly the same thing. So that is just a way of formalizing the idea that we want the focal preference to rank the decision maker's choice as high up in the choice set as possible. So that is the object that we're going to be looking for. Now, it's not obvious that that must exist, and in fact, in existing models, it doesn't. But it turns out in this model, it does exist and is unique. In fact, uniqueness follows from the definition once you have existence. So the key point is existence. It also turns out that the data requirements for recovering it are very minimal, and the algorithm for constructing it is simple. But before I explain how that works, I need to tell you more about the structure of the data that's consistent with the model. And that, of course, is a representation theorem. Now, to show you the representation theorem, I'm going to do this in two parts. I'm first going to start with an easier exercise, where we've got a candidate preference for the decision maker. And then we want to know under what conditions is there a set of justifications such that the candidate preference and the set of justifications together represent choice behavior. It turns out that this simpler exercise is solved by one axiom, which I call irrelevance of unjustifiable alternatives. It says that if an alternative is available and it's preferred to whatever the decision maker actually chose, then that alternative is irrelevant on any superset of the original choice set. Now, so this result just says that this axiom is necessary and sufficient for the model given a particular candidate preference. I'm going to skip the proof today. What's more important is that a similar condition to irrelevance of unjustifiable alternatives is going to turn out to characterize the general model when we don't have any candidate preference for the decision maker. The only difference is that here we've used the preference to determine which alternatives are unjustifiable, because we've said an alternative is unjustifiable if it's available and it's preferred to whatever you actually chose. If you don't have the candidate preference, of course, you can't do that, but it turns out that you can use choice to pick out the unjustifiable alternatives, and then you can characterize the model in the same way. So let's see how that works. It turns out that we can identify all the unjustifiable choices by recognizing two simple choice patterns. So I'll tell you what those choice patterns are. I'll tell you what they inform us about the decision maker's justifications, and then I'll characterize the model. The first pattern consists of chains. Now, chains are built up of three-element cycles. And a cycle is defined in the natural way. A is chosen over B, B is chosen over D, D is chosen over A, and then B is chosen from the full set. Now, I didn't include that B is chosen over D here. It turns out that in the context of this model, those two are equivalent. It's easier to think about in the way that I said it verbally, so you can go ahead and do that. And then chains are built up just by putting adjacent pairs from cycles one after the other. So this definition is just a formalization of that. So if AI and AI plus 1 are adjacent in a chain, then there's some Z such that AI plus 1 Z or Z AI plus 1 is a cycle. So again, that's just a chain just comes from taking adjacent pairs from cycles and then linking them together. Why do we care about chains? Because it turns out that if A precedes B in a chain, but B is chosen over A, then it must be unjustifiable to choose A over B in any justification representation. More formally, for any set of justifications that's consistent with this choice behavior, every justification in that set must prefer B to A. So we've seen that chains allow us to determine whenever it's unjustifiable to choose one alternative over another. That's the first choice pattern. Here's the second one. It's called an almost consistent set. Say that a set is consistent if, for any alternative that is pairwise chosen over every other alternative in the set, that alternative must be chosen from the set. And then say that a set is almost consistent if it isn't consistent, but all of its non-empty proper subsets are. Now, why do we care about almost consistent sets? Because you can show that if A is almost consistent, it contains an item that pairwise beats whatever's chosen from A, and it's unjustifiable to choose that item from A in any justification representation. More formally, for any set of justifications, for every justification in that set, there exists an alternative in the choice set that is preferred to the item in question, A star. So what does this tell us? It tells us that it is unjustifiable to choose one alternative over a non-singleton set of other alternatives. So chains told us it's unjustifiable to choose one alternative over another. Almost consistent sets told us it's unjustifiable to choose one alternative over a set of other alternatives. And then it turns out that this is all we need to identify the unjustifiable choices. So let's just summarize what I've told you about the relationship between these two patterns and unjustifiable choices. That's what this definition does. And then we can just characterize the model in the same way that we did before by saying that unjustifiable alternatives are irrelevant. And so that is the axiomatic representation theorem for the general model when we don't know the decision maker's preference. I know that was a bit fast, so I'll pause here if there are questions.
I don't have a question, but I would like to summarize what you've done, just for you to tell me if I followed you.
Okay.
All right, is that okay?
Sure.
So here's what I understood you saying so far. So you start with these models and you say that they have identification problems, and what that means is because they have preferences and what you call in justifications, we don't know exactly what's driving behavior. Is it coming from preference or is it coming from justification, right? So we have this identification problem. And then what you did later on was to say, maybe these models are too flexible, so let's consider a special case of them, right? And in this special case, we'll be able to do these identifications, and the way you did it was to start with an axiom, which is a bit unusual because it has preferences in it. And then you say, but these preferences is going to become review preferences. And so eventually, later on, everything is going to become choice. And in this process, you were saying how the at least how part of the identification problem comes in, because to transform preferences into review preferences, you're from choice itself saying what the preferences should be. Is that a fair summary?
Close. So I guess two things. One thing is that you don't actually need this warm-up exercise for the purpose of stating the representation theorem. I'm just explaining it to you because I think it's helpful for expositional purposes, but the representation theorem really starts here. Now, I haven't, the object that we're ultimately looking for is the focal preference, which is defined in this way. I haven't shown you the result that says the focal preference exists yet. I started with this representation theorem because I think it is useful for understanding where the focal preference comes from. The ultimate identification result is just going to be that the focal preference exists and is unique, and then I can tell you how to construct it, which will be simpler now that you've seen this.
What is the focal preference?
It is a preference with this property. So for any choice set, it ranks whatever the decision maker selected from that set as high up in the preference ranking on that set as possible, given the other choices the person made. So you can think of this intuitively as the preference that makes the decision maker's choices as close to preference maximization as possible.
Okay.
And this is a natural thing to look at because we want conservative departures from preference maximization. We don't want to be attributing choices to justifications rather than preferences if there's no evidence that we actually need to do that. And so it turns out that in this special case of existing models, this focal preference is always going to exist for any data set that's consistent with the model. It's going to be unique, and there's going to be a simple way to recover it from the data.
That's okay, but you started the talk by saying the key problem is this identification between justifications of preferences, right? Because we don't know if certain behaviors are really coming from discrimination or not. And so how is this focal preference be used in order to do that, to find out what's driving behavior?
Sure. So you might argue that, maybe the focal preference, maybe we can recover the focal preference, but maybe there are other preferences that are consistent with the data, and maybe those are the correct ones. Sure, it's possible that those are the correct ones, but I think that there's a good argument that this is the preference that we'd want to look at when we're analyzing the data. And the problem is that in existing models, this thing isn't going to exist. So you can't even get that much identification. You can't even say, if we want to be conservative about departures from preference maximization, then here's the preference. That's just not going to work in those models, but it is in this one. Now, there's another thing I can say. If you don't like the idea of the focal preference, one thing we can say using the representation theorem is that all minimal examples of justifying behavior are actually going to reduce to cycles and almost consistent sets. What do I mean by minimal? I mean that if you took away an alternative, then it wouldn't be an example of justifying behavior anymore. It would just be preference maximization. Mm-hmm. It turns out that on those minimal examples, the justification model delivers a unique preference. So not a focal preference anymore. Preference is just completely pinned down on those examples. So that indicates that even if you don't want to look at the focal preference, as long as you want to look at simple examples that we're likely to get from experiments or that we're likely to get as stylized facts about people's behavior, you're actually going to get uniqueness of the preference. The only time that you need to worry about the focal preference is when you have more complicated situations rather than these minimal examples. So maybe that will help.
But just to make sure I'm understanding the big picture, you are going to observe the choices. From these choices, you're going to identify uniquely these focal preferences. These focal preferences are the closest that one would get if we were using a standard maximization model, and it is from that will at least help determine what is driving behavior. If it is ethics, right? By ethics, I'm talking justifications or preferences. Is that right?
Right. My argument is that the focal preference is your best guess of what the person's preference is. So that is the preference that is driving behavior. Now, like I said, if you don't want to look at the focal preference, as long as you have a minimal example, which is what you're likely to get in an experiment or from a stylized fact, you don't even have to make that argument and you get a unique preference.
Okay.
Okay. So let's skip this proof sketch. Let me just show you the result. The focal preference exists. It's unique. This is just the definition of the focal preference. So this theorem is just establishing existence of the focal preference. And then it tells you how to construct it. A is preferred to B by the focal preference if and only if A precedes B in a chain, or neither item precedes the other in a chain, and A is pairwise chosen over B. So the construction is fairly simple. All you need to be able to do is recognize cycles. Cycles will tell you what the chains are. You use those to construct the focal preference. Now, here's an illustration of why the focal preference is helpful. Let's go back to this example from the beginning. Remember that the issue was we couldn't distinguish between prejudiced and unprejudiced preferences. Now, in the justification model, we get that A is preferred to D. So in fact, the decision maker is prejudiced. That is consistent with the intuitive interpretation, which has been given by other authors. Now, as I mentioned, in fact, the focal preference is the only possible preference here. That might not be the case in more complex, non-minimal examples, but it is the case on every minimal example. Now, I'm now in a position to say why this example isn't special. It's not special because this is a cycle, and we've seen that exactly this structure has to arise whenever it's unjustifiable to choose one alternative over another. So if you have serious identification problems on cycles, those are very likely to occur in pretty much any data set that provides evidence of justification. This just establishes that you don't need much data to construct the focal preference. All you need to collect is pairwise choice, and then any triples on which pairwise choice is cyclic. And I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. I'm just going to tell you there's also an identification result for the unjustifiable choices, not just the preferences. So let's move on to between subject data. Let me remind you why we cared about this. If we have people who want to conceal their preferences, which is likely in these types of situations, and if we're unable to distract them enough and they catch on to what we're doing, they might avoid the inconsistencies that we needed in the first part in order to identify their preferences. Simplest way to address this is move from a deterministic environment to a stochastic environment. So I'll now be working with a stochastic choice function rho instead of a choice function C. And you can interpret this as data from a large population of subjects, each of whom is only going to make one choice. So these consistency motives are just wiped out. Now, just like with random utility, it turns out that we get better tractability and identification by moving to a domain of lotteries and imposing expected utility. And so I'm going to do that. Here's the model. Base set of alternatives is finite, but the domain of choice will be the set of lotteries over that base set of choices. Preferences will be expected utility. Sets of justifications will be closed and convex. Now, a probability measure P on preferences and sets of justifications represents a stochastic choice function rho if the probability of choosing little a from big A is the probability under P of drawing a preference and a set of justifications such that little a would be chosen from big A in the deterministic model corresponding to that preference and set of justifications. So this is probably exactly what you would expect. I'll impose some more conditions on this later on, but this is what I'm going to start off with. Now, to give you an idea of where I'm going, there are two types of inferences that we can make in this model. Qualitative inferences tell us whether some people lack a justification for choosing one alternative over another. Why do we care about these? Because they tell us in what choice situations and in what direction behavior is going to depart from preference maximization. Now, it turns out that drawing qualitative inferences is simple and it doesn't require a lot of data. Quantitative inferences will tell us how many people lack a justification for choosing one alternative over another. And so they'll tell us how far behavior departs from preference maximization. It turns out that you can draw these inferences in principle, but it is not that easy and it does require a lot of data. So for experimenters, point one would probably be the most interesting. Now, I'm not going to do any proofs in this section because they tend to be long and complicated. So I'm going to give you a motivating example that should illustrate what kinds of behavior you should expect in this model. Two treatments, blue and red. Blue treatment, people are choosing between going home, chatting with colleagues, or continuing to work. Red is almost the same, but now work has to be done with a colleague. And with some probability, no work will be done because the colleague will prefer instead to socialize. So here are the two menus corresponding to the two treatments. Random expected utility says that the probability of chat over here does not change as we move between these two menus. And that's true no matter what the distribution of preferences looks like. But it turns out that in the justification model, there will be two forces on the probability of chat, and they're going to push in opposite directions. So let me tell you what those are. First, some people who prefer home to chat to work can justify going home in the red menu, but not in the blue menu. And that's going to push the probability of chat downward as we move from blue to red, because there were people who were over here who are now shifting to their preferred alternative home. It turns out that as we make the red menu arbitrarily close to the blue menu, this force is coming from people who have an obligation to choose work over home. Second force, some people who prefer work to chat to home can justify choosing work in the blue menu, but not in the red menu. And then as we make the red menu arbitrarily close to the blue menu, this force is coming from people who have an obligation to choose home over work. Now, why does this example matter? Because if we look at the sign of the difference in the probability of chat across the two menus, that's going to give us a qualitative inference. Because if we observe that the probability of chat is higher on the blue menu than the red menu, then we know that there are people who can't justify choosing home over work from point one. So we've learned something about the structure of the obligations that people perceive. Now, the first result is really just going to formalize that example. So it's going to give us a way of drawing qualitative inferences. One piece of notation. For a menu X, let W of X denote the set of lotteries that it's sometimes unjustifiable to choose over that menu X. Intuitively, you can think of this as the morally worse than set of X, the set of alternatives that are morally worse than X, if you're in a moral situation. Now, the next definition formalizes the structure of the example. Say a triple ABD is anomalous if the probability of D falls when B is replaced with an epsilon mixture of D and B. So if we go back to the example and we observe that the probability of chat is higher on the blue menu than the red menu, then the triple homework chat is anomalous. And then here's the result. If ABD is anomalous, then A is in the closure of the morally worse than set of B. So if we observe that the probability of chat is higher on the blue menu than the red menu, then we've learned that home is in the closure of the morally worse than set of work. Now, the problem with this result so far is that we don't know exactly when we should expect anomalous menus to exist. So we don't know, for instance, that every qualitative inference can be drawn by observing an anomalous menu. The problem, basically, is that there are these two forces operating at once. And so even if there are people who can't justify choosing home over work, and you'd like to use this construction to identify them, there might be people in this second group who can't justify choosing work over home, and they're going to be pushing the sign of the probability of chat in the wrong direction. So this suggests that we might be able to make progress by ruling out the possibility that people perceive diametrically opposing obligations. Because if we do that, going back to the example, then only one of these forces will be operating, and so we'll be able to draw our qualitative inference. Now, formally, here's the assumption we need, which I call limited disagreement because it limits the disagreement between the sets of justifications. Here's what it says. If A is in the closure of the morally worse than set of B, for all A in the menu big A, then B is not in the closure of the morally worse than set of big A. What does this say? Well, first, let's just focus on the case where the menu big A is a singleton. Then what this says is that if A is morally worse than B, B cannot be morally worse than A. So this is saying that people don't perceive diametrically opposing obligations. Now let's consider the case that A is a menu. Then what we're doing is we're saying that if A is morally worse than B and D is morally worse than B, we can't mix A and D to get something that is morally better than B. So again, we're imposing some sort of consistency requirement on the moral obligations that people can perceive. And then we'll need some technical conditions. These are less substantive than the limited disagreement assumption here. Let's assume that the distribution over preferences admits a density. You don't actually need that for this result, but you need it later on. Let's assume that all preferences are possible and can occur with any set of justifications that is also possible. So it's not the case that some preferences only occur with certain sets of justifications. You could relax the assumption that all preferences are possible. This is just the simplest assumption that we can make. And then finally, we need, for any set of justifications that doesn't already permit anything, it must be possible to enlarge that set of justifications just a little bit. So if you know a particular group of people who perceive a particular set of obligations, you can find another group of people who perceive just slightly weaker obligations than those original people do. And then under these assumptions, we can draw all of the qualitative inferences about the model from anomalous menus. So this simple structure that I showed you in the example can be used to draw every qualitative inference about this random justification model. And that's what this result says. It says that you can fully pin down the morally worse than set of any alternative just by looking at anomalous menus. Okay. So that's it for qualitative inferences. Before I go on to quantitative inferences, let me try to explain to you why I think these results matter. First, they tell us where to look for evidence of justification. Because we know that to look for evidence that people are acting against their preferences, we need to find an anomalous menu. And in fact, the example gives us some guidance on how to find an anomalous menu. First, start with two options, A and B, such that some people feel obligated to choose B over A. So B is more morally compelling than A. Then find a third option that some people will like less than A and more than B, and will sometimes feel able to justify even when they can't justify their favorite option A. So for instance, A could be do nothing, B could be do a hard and important task, and D could be do an easy and somewhat important task. Now, if you observe that A, B, D is indeed anomalous, then what we've learned is that some people prefer A to B, but feel obligated to choose B over A instead. Now, I want to clarify that we have learned a general fact about the choice between A and B. We're not just learning about this very specific situation where we've got D and then we're mixing D with B. We've learned a general fact about whenever people face a choice between A and B, we know that some of them prefer A, but feel obligated to choose B instead. Another thing that this result allows us to do is to test the model, because often we have plausible restrictions on the obligations that people are likely to perceive. For instance, it's very unlikely that someone would feel obligated to do nothing rather than choose a difficult and important task. And that indicates that BAD should not be anomalous here, because the only way to interpret that, if we did observe that BAD was anomalous, is to conclude that some people feel obligated to do nothing rather than a difficult and important task. So that's why I think this result is a useful one. Now let's move on to quantitative inferences. Now, as you might suspect, full identification is not going to be possible in general. And the reason is basically the same as in the deterministic case, because we might have people with very saintly preferences who would never want to do anything that is unjustifiable. And for these people, we're never going to be able to identify their sets of justifications, because if you never want to violate your constraints, then we can't figure out what those constraints are. So to make progress, we can focus on the people who always want to violate any constraints they face. So the people at the other end of the spectrum. And the broad idea, although it turns out to be somewhat complicated to execute, is to construct menus that allow us to separately observe what these people are doing from what other people are doing. Formally, here are the people we want to look at. Fix a subspace of lotteries, X, and then say that a preference is unjustifiable on X if, for any little x in X, the decision maker prefers the things that are morally worse than X to X. So this is just a way of formalizing that we're looking at the people with the least justifiable preferences who always want to violate any of the constraints that they face. And then here's the result. If rho has regulation representations, P and Q, that satisfy limited disagreement, then if you fix any two-dimensional subspace of the set of lotteries, and you fix any two lotteries A and B in that subspace, such that A is morally worse than B, then P and Q agree on the probability that there is no justification for choosing A over B, given that the preference is unjustifiable. Now, why do we care about this result? Well, in the simple case that preferences and sets of justifications are drawn independently, what this result allows us to do is to get full identification on binary menus, because we can fully pin down exactly who prefers A to B, who prefers B to A, and who feels obligated to choose B over A. But under the more reasonable assumption that people with the least justifiable preferences are actually less constrained than other people, then what this result is giving us is a lower bound on the proportion of people who are constrained in any given binary menu. And a lower bound is nice because it means that we're being conservative about departures from preference maximization. So we're getting as close to preference maximization on any binary menu that we can, given the behavior that we've observed. Now, again, this result is more interesting as a statement about the properties of the model and how far you could go with it. It's unlikely that you would really be able to implement this result experimentally. If you're an experimenter, you probably want to stick to the first couple of results in this section. Okay. So that's it for between subject data. I'll pause if there are questions here.
I have a question. So if I understand correctly, this section is to say what kind of choice set should an experimenter give to the subjects in order to understand what are the justifications.
That's right.
Yeah, but do you have any results on like what are the most efficient ways if I want to understand the true preference of the subjects, given the existence of the justifications?
Right. So for this, you can use this quantitative result to make an inference about preferences. Since what you're getting is a bound on the justifications, you'll get something similar for preferences. And what you'll get is an overestimate of the proportion of people who actually prefer the morally better alternative. So you will get the result that, some people who are choosing the morally better alternative don't prefer it, but you're being conservative about how big that gap is between what people chose and what they preferred. So once you know this, you can use it to make an inference about people's preferences. For the qualitative case, I'm not sure that there is an analog to qualitative inferences about preferences, because you're going to be looking at situations where any expected utility preference is fairly reasonable. So you're not going to be looking at situations where there's a dominance relationship, because that wouldn't be very interesting. And in that context, I don't see a qualitative inference that you could make about preferences. So the preferences are covered in the quantitative part.
I see, thanks.
Okay. All right, so I'll tell you briefly about information choice. Again, let me remind you why we care about it, because our strongest evidence for a conflict between preferences and justifications actually comes from experiments on information choice. And these experiments are captured in the moral wiggle room literature, which finds that people often avoid information about the effects of their actions on other people. Now, these experiments fit very nicely into the setup for the random justification model. Here's the setup. Subjects first choose between two lotteries over binary menus. One of them is uninformative, so it's just a menu, a particular menu for sure. The other lottery is a probability distribution over a set of menus that average out to the menu in the uninformative lottery. And then now that I have this set up, I'll just use the random justification model to address some of the questions that are raised by the experimental literature, but go beyond particular experimental findings. First question. We know that people often avoid information that they do not want. Given that, you might wonder whether free information can actually change the behavior of someone who doesn't already have virtuous preferences. Now, while you might think that the answer is no, it turns out to be yes in an interesting class of situations, which I call orderly. Intuition first. A situation is orderly if different sets of justifications can disagree about how strict to be, but don't have more substantive disagreements. Now, here's the formal definition. Take A and B that are open, non-empty, convex subsets of lotteries, and suppose that everything in A is morally worse than everything in B. Then a situation is orderly if there don't exist A and A hat in A, B and B hat in B, and then two different possible sets of justifications, such that one justification allows you to pick A over B, but not A hat over B hat, while the other set of justifications allows you to pick A hat over B hat, but not to pick A over B. And so you can see that this definition is saying different sets of justifications don't have substantive disagreements in this situation. So I guess that, are there questions about this? Okay, the reason that this definition is helpful is it's going to allow a policymaker to construct a signal that is not going to make behavior worse for any group of agents and is going to make behavior better for some of them. So here's the result. Suppose you've got an orderly situation, and suppose that you've got a policy preference that is virtuous, meaning that it prefers all of the virtuous alternatives in B rather than the less virtuous alternatives in A. Then, for almost any choice pair in this situation, there exists a signal about that choice pair such that every person who disagrees with the policymaker on the original choice pair makes the policymaker weakly better off by acquiring the signal. And there is a positive probability set of such people who want to take the signal strictly and make the policymaker strictly better off when they do so. So this says that in an orderly situation, the policymaker can construct a signal that is going to reach some of the people at least some of the people who disagree with him, whose preferences are different from his on the original choice set. Now, what's going on here? Intuitively, the policymaker is reaching people whose preferences aren't too misaligned with his. Specifically, he's reaching people who agree with him on one of the realizations of the signal, even though they disagree on the original choice pair. And so in this result, free information has to be instrumental to be successful, meaning it has to change what alternative people actually want to choose. It can't reach people who disagree with the policymaker on every signal realization. Now, you might think that that's obvious, but it turns out that it actually goes away if people are uncertain about what they will be able to justify. So for instance, if they're making a choice of information long before they're making a choice over final outcomes, then it turns out the policymaker can actually reach some people who disagree with them on every signal realization. And intuitively, what's going on there is that he's able to reach people who have a much stronger preference in some realizations than others. And so he's able to reach people who are willing to be more constrained in one signal realization where they don't have a very strong preference because they greatly value being less constrained in another. Second question, given this previous result that free information can be helpful, you might want to know, you might think that the best policy for a policymaker who wants to encourage virtuous behavior is to just give out as much information as possible and then see what people will take. But it turns out that this is not the case in an interesting class of situations that I call ambiguous. Intuitively, a set of choice pairs is ambiguous if some less than virtuous decision makers would find it optimal to appeal to different justifications on different pairs, rather than sticking with one single justification. Formal definition, same setup as before. A and B are open, non-empty, convex subsets of lotteries, and A is morally worse than B. Say that AB is unambiguous if, for every set of justifications, there is a justification in that set that is maximally permissive, meaning it only rules out choosing A over B if every single justification in the set B does. Otherwise, AB is ambiguous. So unambiguous if there's always just one maximally permissive justification, ambiguous if there sometimes is no such maximally permissive justification, and so you have to choose between different justifications. So you may choose between different justifications on different choice pairs. Here's the result. If you've got an ambiguous situation and a policy maker that is virtuous, then there exists a signal about some choice pair in that situation and a positive probability set of people who are made better off by taking the signal and make the policymaker worse off when they do so. And in fact, this is realization by realization. The people in the set are better off realization by realization than if they hadn't gotten the signal, while the policymaker is worse off realization by realization. And let me just give you a quick example of this result. Suppose that a college wants to privilege certain groups of students, but it's not allowed to explicitly, say for legal reasons. Then one thing it might do is solicit a lot of information about applicants, the relative importance of which is ambiguous, such as essays, extracurriculars, leadership activities, and so on, and then decide what to prioritize on a case-by-case basis. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that universities actually do this. Now, I'm not trying to say that this is an immoral practice or that it should be banned. I'm just saying that this is an example of this result. Whether you think that it's moral or immoral depends, of course, on your political views. I'm going to skip over the last result, but if you want to talk separately about why justifiers are able to avoid information, I'm happy to do that. That's what this result is about. So I'll just wrap up. I've shown you a model of justification that first resolves identification problems with existing models. Second, can be productively applied to between subject data, and I've suggested some experiments to do that. And then finally, unites the moral wiggle room literature with other work on justification. So looking forward to hearing questions and comments.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. Now we're moving to Q&A session. As usually, let's start with our panelists. If there's anything that you would like to add or comment on or ask. Yucheng, Alvaro?
Well, I'm not sure if it's exactly a question, but about the last part, I was wondering, it might be a little bit disconnected from the results and the model, but there are models of information avoidance that don't seem directly connected with these two-stage models, right? So they usually motivate with things like anxiety. So I would like to learn information later on. And I think Larbi Alawi, I don't know if his paper was published or not in the end, but he pushes this to infinity, right? So it's not that I want to know later, I want to know at infinity, which means never. And there has never been a very clear connection between these models of preference for delaying the time that you receive information, or even at infinity, and these two-stage models. But here you somehow are talking about these two things within the same framework, right? And so
Right.
I guess the question is, do you see any possibility of relating this literature somehow?
I think definitely I want to relate to the moral wiggle room literature, but that's a specific type of information avoidance. So
Yes.
they're looking at situations where I want to take a particular action because it's advantageous to me, but it might be harmful to you. And I have the option to learn whether it's harmful to you, but the finding is that a lot of people don't, and they just take the option that is good for them. I don't think that is the same mechanism as, for instance, why you might not want to learn about your stock portfolio, or you might not want to learn whether you have Huntington's disease or something like that. So
Exactly.
I don't think that I don't think it would be reasonable to try to extend this model to those types of situations. But I also think that it's pretty clear that the moral wiggle room literature is relying on sort of different mechanisms, because usually those experiments would have a control treatment where, rather than learning something about my moral obligations, like whether I might be harming you, I may be learning something about payoffs to myself, and they find that you don't get information avoidance in those types of situations. So I'm looking at this particular type of information avoidance that occurs where I might be doing something that's morally wrong and I don't want to learn about that, but certainly not all types of information avoidance.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have two questions about identification. So one question is, in many experiments, we experiment to have a rough sense of what the justifications look like. For example, we know that people want to be generous. So that is one dimension which probably enters into the preference in the script M. So I wonder if adding more structure to your set M can help with identification. For example, saying that the preferences are on certain attributes of the choices, etc. Yeah, that was one question, although it's probably a little bit ill-formed. Another question about identification is that I was wondering if running both within subjects experiment and across subjects experiment can help with identification, because when you run within subject experiment, you kind of force people to take a stance on which justification they want to take consistently. And that somehow feels like can help you understand which justification is less costly from a true preference point of view. But that's just a rough thought.
Yeah. Okay. As for the first point, I think that might be possible. It's not really something that I've considered a lot. Now, the one thing I have considered is that if you're in a situation where you have reasonable restrictions on what the justifications can look like, you can certainly use the existing results to test the model, because you can set up, your 3-element menu, and then you do perturbations on it, just like in the example. Sometimes you should get an anomalous menu, and sometimes you should not. And then based on your predictions for what the justification should look like, you have clear predictions on when you should get it and when you shouldn't. And so that's one thing that you can do. But as for helping with identification, I think it might. I'm not sure whether it would lead to more interesting results, but that's probably something that I should think about. And then, okay, the second question. Yeah, I think one issue there is that in this model, there isn't an ordering over the justifications. Now, in practice, there probably is. Some justifications look more moral than others. And so I might, if I'm indifferent, then I'll certainly want to reach for the most moral one. So if you extended the model to allow for that, then I guess that's what the setup you were suggesting would be most helpful for, right? Or was that not your?
I think I was thinking about a slightly different thing, which is, suppose I ask you to make multiple choices with multiple choice sets. And because this is a within subject treatment, you have to decide whether you want all the choices to adhere to justification 1 or justification 2. Even though the 2 justifications are not ordered, the choices that I make that adhere to justification 1 is probably different in terms of how I really prefer, how my really true preference says compared to the other sets of choices I make. So yeah, that's what I was thinking about.
Yeah, that's I guess that's the other alternative to just using a stochastic choice function. I think the issue I ran into there is it's not entirely clear to me what people would do, because it's possible that they would just pick one justification and stick with it. I'm not sure that people are that sophisticated. So probably what they're going to do is they'll try to get closer to preference maximization than they would if they knew that no single person was observing all their choices. But they'd probably, they probably still wouldn't go all the way there. And so it seems like it might get a bit complicated. And then you have to think about, if I'm choosing between justification 1 and 2, and then that justification is good in some situations and not others, then you have to think about how people are going to trade off those different situations. So you would probably still need that, nice expected utility setup that we're already using in the random justification model. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe there is something extra there that you could learn.
I see. Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience at this stage? If yes, just unmute yourself and fire away. Can I ask a question? You mentioned it towards the end about the policymaker who wants to do something and has some moral stance on that, but that is exogenous. It's not coming from. It's not a welfare function of any kind that individuals participating in all that. According to that, there should be a norm in some way aggregated to that.
Right. The policymaker is definitely not aggregating people's preferences. What the policymaker is doing is, when you impose limited disagreement, it ensures that there are some preferences that never like anything that's morally worse. So the assumption is just that the policymaker has one of those preferences, and the intuition is that the policymaker wants to encourage the behavior that is considered moral by the people in the society, but he's not aggregating their preferences in any way.
I see. Anyone else? Any comments? Well, in that case, we still have a couple of minutes, but in that case, if maybe we can just stop the official part of the seminar. So thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists as well and the audience for participating. See you next week.